This is not the tale of a traitor. It is the story of a man who wore a mask of loyalty so perfectly that in the end it swallowed him whole. He carries a burden that lives quietly in each of us, the shadow of the Deceiver. And the price of his betrayal was not 30 silver coins, but the collapse of his own self. Today, we descend into the psyche of Judas Iscariot through the lens of Carl Jung's analytical psychology. Judas embodies the cost of wearing the Judas mask, the collective persona, far too long, hiding his repressed ambition and his demand for a political messiah, the mark of an animus left unintegrated. His betrayal was never the root, it was the symptom of a deeper wound, the inability to unite who he truly was with what the world insisted he should be. His journey is a powerful metaphor for the silver coins we trade every day, the small betrayals of our own soul in exchange for acceptance, approval, and the illusion of belonging. If you've ever felt the weight of pretending, if you've ever sacrificed your truth in the name of loyalty, or wondered why outer disappointments cut so deeply, this story is your mirror. Don't walk this path alone. Subscribe now to Shadow Work Stories so YouTube understands the depth of this work and continues guiding you through your own journey of individuation. Leave a like and let us uncover the shadow of the Deceiver together. What truly hid behind the mask of the faithful disciple? What did he expect the master to be, and why did his shattered ideal become betrayal? The answer lies in the persona he could not release, and in the emptiness it carved within him. To unravel the true mystery behind Judas's betrayal, we must first tear the veil that hides the man behind the role. We must examine the persona he chose to wear, the mask the world saw, the mask that eventually smothered him. In Carl Jung's psychology, the persona is the social mask. It is our shield, the role we adopt to survive the outer world, to satisfy collective expectations and secure acceptance. Judas was not merely a disciple, he was the steward, the treasurer, the one who handled the practical machinery of the mission. He embodied an ideal of loyalty that was conditional, rational, rooted in logos at its most pragmatic, earthly form. Yet Judas's persona was a direct projection of the collective shadow of his time. A nation living under Roman domination did not long for a spiritual Messiah, humble, surrendered, sacrificial. It yearned for a political leader, a new David, a warrior, a restorer of Israel's earthly glory. The collective repressed its hunger for revolution and power, an unintegrated animus in its most aggressive expression, and poured that expectation into the Messiah. Judas, the man of reason, became the perfect vessel for that hope. He projected onto the master the catalyst for the earthly power his persona demanded. He was not loyal to a message of love, eros, nor to a kingdom beyond this world. His loyalty was to the archetypal function he expected the master to fulfill, the revolutionary leader who would reshape reality through force, proving his investment of faith to be practical and profitable. Unconsciously, he was saying, "I am loyal to your glory, but that glory must appear as visible power, as triumph over the empire. You must validate my rational persona." But Judas's persona was rigid, a metal armor with no give. It lacked the softness to receive the truth of the soul, eros. And the more the Master spoke of a kingdom not of this world, the more Judas's persona collided with that truth. Loyalty began to fracture, not in a single night, but in the slow, aching unraveling of disillusionment. The climax of this inner war came when the Master refused to seize the power Judas believed he was destined to claim. Judas demanded the logos of the sword and the uprising. The Master insisted on the eros of sacrifice. The ideal of power Judas had projected was collapsing, and with it, the mask that had defined him. Thus, the betrayal reveals itself not as greed, but as a desperate attempt to resurrect the ideal he had already murdered within his own soul. With the most destructive act, he tried to force the Master to fight, to rebel, to become the hero his persona required. The kiss was not merely a sign, but a psychological ultimatum. Reveal yourself now. Show your power. Be the Messiah my people and I demand. When that projection shattered, it awakened the shadow of the deceiver within him. The fear of having wasted years following a weak ideal. The resentment of unmet revolution. It all bubbled up from the unconscious. He could not accept that the Master's self, his wholeness, did not fit inside Judas's collective persona. The betrayal was his final attempt to steer destiny, even at the cost of destroying it. His loyalty had always been conditional, a projected expectation doomed to collapse. And when that projection broke, what rose from Judas's unconscious to fill the void? The shadow of his own ambition and his own despair. Now that the mask has fallen, we witness the birth of the shadow of the deceiver, and why the silver coins became an unbearable weight, a corrosive symbol of how deeply he had devalued his own soul. The collapse of the persona of the faithful disciple tore open an irreparable fissure in Judas's psyche, and through that fracture, the shadow of the deceiver erupted, not as an external force, but as the accumulation of everything his rigid ego had pushed into darkness. In Jung's view, the shadow is all that the ego rejects: weakness, fear, sexuality. But in Judas's case, it was above all his unresolved ambition and his hunger for political control. Judas's ego, anchored in practical logos, could not admit that he was capable of betrayal, manipulation, or the deep resentment that simmered beneath the surface. All of it was cast into the shadow, waiting patiently for a moment of imbalance to rise. That moment arrived when the Master refused to match the projected ideal. The shadow of the deceiver is more than greed. It is a destructive complex that seeks to justify its existence through forced control. Judas could not accept what he perceived as the Master's failure. So he tried to rewrite the script, manipulating events to force, in his fractured imagination, a divine intervention. The betrayal was a psychological assault disguised as a transaction. He believed that by exposing the master to danger, he would compel him to unleash the power he assumed was being held back. The kiss was no gesture of affection, but a confession. I know who you are, and I am handing you over. Now prove yourself to be what I need. The 30 pieces of silver are the most tragic symbol of all. They do not reflect the master's worth, but the worth Judas assigned to his own faith, to his own loyalty, after disillusionment set in. The paltry value reveals the truth. This was never a financial act, but an existential collapse. The coins are the caustic emblem of his failure to embody the ideal disciple, and of the bitterness that filled the void. By accepting them, Judas materialized his shadow. He became the deceiver he feared. He became an agent of chaos, a man who tried to force destiny when destiny refused to obey his design. He projected his own failure onto the master. If he were strong, he would not be taken. It is his fault for not using his power. This is the classic defense of an ego unwilling to accept responsibility for its own disillusionment, its own inability to transform desire into constructive action. But Judas' most tragic hour was not the kiss. It was the silence that followed. When the master surrendered, Judas's final hope collapsed. His attempt at manipulation failed. He did not force the Messiah to reveal himself. He only revealed the deceiver living in his own shadow. And once exposed, the shadow did not return to the unconscious. It began to devour him. The terror Judas felt as he watched the master condemned was not mere remorse, it was the brutal confrontation with the truth that he had become the very evil he feared. He became a traitor, not through a single act, but through the accumulation of countless betrayals against his own inner truth. He sought a hero and found a martyr. So now, what is the true psychological weight of those 30 silver coins upon his soul? The remorse that followed was not repentance, but the agony of an ego in collapse. And here we uncover the crucial difference between the toxic guilt that leads to death and the pain that, when embraced, opens the path to transformation and to wholeness. The act of betrayal was complete, but Judas's psyche found no relief, only a hell of self-contempt. Here the story descends into the chasm between two psychological forces crucial to individuation: remorse and repentance. What Judas felt as he watched the master condemned was not the repentance that leads toward individuation, the path toward wholeness, toward transforming the shadow. What consumed him was toxic remorse, the corrosive ache of an ego collapsing in on itself. Remorse is always egocentric. It clings to humiliation, to the loss of status, to the wound of having failed. Judas's ego, built on the rigid pillars of logos and the persona of the practical executor, could not bear the enormity of his catastrophe. Remorse whispers, "I am wicked because I did something terrible, and now I suffer for it. The blame lies in my error." It is destructive because it chains the psyche to the past, to self-condemnation, to the theatrics of personal tragedy. It blinds the eyes to the future and blocks any hope of repair. Repentance, by contrast, is a movement of the self. It feels the pain of wrongdoing, yet immediately turns toward transformation. Repentance says, "I have done something terrible, but I will use this pain as fuel to change, to act differently, to grow." It is constructive, projecting its energy forward, toward wholeness. Judas, however, was crushed beneath guilt, a mechanism of the ego that imprisons rather than liberates. The clearest evidence is his desperate attempt to return the 30 pieces of silver. That act was the confession that money had never been the point. The coins were the physical embodiment of his shadow, the tangible relic of his failure. When Judas tried to return them, he was pleading beneath the surface, "Take back this symbol of my shadow. Strip me of this flaw. I cannot carry the weight of my own unconscious." He was trying to project his guilt back onto the society that had first nurtured the expectation of revolution. But the priest's refusal sealed his fate. They would not carry his burden. They forced him to face the truth. The sin and the shadow were his and only his. He could no longer hide behind persona or behind the projections of a collective dream. Here Judas stood at the tragic crossroads of his journey. He had two paths before him. 1. The path of the self, repentance. To accept the shadow, to accept the error, to embrace humility, and begin the painful ascent toward individuation, the path where the ego bows before the self. 2. The path of the ego, remorse, to reject the exposed shadow, to condemn himself, and to destroy the vessel, his own body, to silence the pain. Judas could not forgive himself. His rational, prideful persona could not bow to vulnerability. The agony of guilt, the refusal to integrate the shadow, these became unbearable. The only exit his rigid, collapsing ego could imagine was total annihilation. He tried to destroy the symbol, but ended up destroying himself. Why did death become the only escape for Judas? And how was his final act, the hanging, a projection of the death that demanded by his imploding persona? What does his hanging reveal about the soul's terror when faced with the shadow it cannot bear to see? Judas found himself trapped in a psychological dead end. He had awakened the shadow of the deceiver through his betrayal, and then tried desperately to extinguish it by returning the coins, seeking a social absolution that was refused. When society declined to carry his burden, he was forced into the final confrontation, the destruction of the one who carried the guilt. His hanging cannot be seen merely as suicide. It is, in Jungian terms, the final and most desperate projection of death from a persona that refused to surrender to the self. Judas's persona was that of the practical man, the rational executor who valued order, success, and above all, control. But betrayal released chaos. It ushered in failure and erased any sense of control over the fate of the master or over his own life. Judas's ego, built upon the rigidity of unintegrated logos, had no access to eros, to feeling, acceptance, humility, and so it could not absorb the magnitude of his mistake. The hanging becomes then an act of archetypal self-flagellation. The ego, unable to bear the stain of the shadow, pronounces death upon the failed persona, and with it, the death of the man himself. This death was not the longing for rest, but a furious, desperate attempt to restore order by wiping the slate clean. It is the vengeance of the rigid persona against the self that dared to falter in the open. The choice of hanging is profoundly symbolic. The noose represents the knot, the binding, the final judgment. Judas, who once sought to be a liberator from Roman oppression in his distorted vision, became the one bound, a prisoner tangled in the threads of his own psyche. He hangs himself to kill the witness of his failure, the exposed shadow of the deceiver, hoping that by destroying the body, he might silence the guilt and the memory of collapse. He refused to walk the path of individuation that his error had opened. Judas's pain was so immense that he could not imagine living as the traitor. To live as the traitor would mean accepting the shadow, accepting his fallibility, and beginning the arduous work of rebuilding the self from the ashes of a shattered persona. This is soul work, shadow work, and Judas rejected it. Individuation requires integrating the shadow, which is the courage to say, yes, I am capable of this darkness, but I choose the light. But Judas chose annihilation over radical acceptance. He was consumed by guilt and remorse that he could not transmute into forgiveness and constructive action. It is a tragic paradox. Judas, who tried to force the master to rise and fight, an unintegrated animus, became the only one to surrender to death, unable to fight for his own soul. His death marks the final triumph of the shadow over the self. The shadow devoured him because he refused to bring it into the light. By projecting his death outward, he cut off the possibility of transformation, remaining trapped in the vicious cycle of guilt and condemnation. He becomes the bearer of the tragic, a dark reminder that the denial of the shadow is far more destructive than the shadow itself. If he could not forgive himself, how could he ever be freed from the shadow that condemned him? The answer lies in the one element he could never betray: his deep and distorted loyalty. So what does Judas's betrayal reveal about the universal wound of broken loyalty and what we lose when we betray ourselves? The story of Judas Iscariot is not about 30 silver coins or a kiss in the dark. It is about the archetypal wound of broken loyalty, a psychological laceration that echoes within all of us whenever we betray something we once held sacred. What did Judas betray? He betrayed the master's self, but more devastatingly, he betrayed the self he could have become. His loyalty ran so deep, was so fundamental to his persona, that when it shattered, the void that followed became fatal. In Jungian terms, Judas had poured all his psychic energy, his libido, into the projection of the master as the political conquering Messiah. This projection was the anchor of his persona. When the master refused to embody it, Judas felt a double betrayal. External betrayal. The authority figure failed to become what he needed him to be. Internal betrayal. The investment of his own life, his 3 years of service, was exposed in the ego's eyes as a catastrophic mistake. Feeling deceived by destiny itself, he turned to retaliation. Judas's betrayal mirrors our own inner betrayals, the price we pay when loyalty to something outside ourselves crushes our deeper loyalty within. How often do we cling to a toxic job, a destructive relationship, or a suffocating family expectation, betraying our own anima, our intuition, our emerging self? Judas's wound is the wound of disconnection. After the deed, he falls into a devastating solitude, not just the physical absence of his companions, but the isolation of an ego that has lost its source of meaning and cannot find the self. He stands alone, confronted by the totality of his failure. A man without a persona, without an integrated shadow, and without a recognized self. He carried not only the shadow, but the archetypal fear of having been wrong about the very purpose of his life. The shadow of the deceiver dragged him into a dead end. Instead of using the pain of his betrayal as a catalyst for healing, saying, "I have betrayed, but I will use this awareness to build a new loyalty to myself," he allowed guilt to lead him into self-destruction. And here lies the essential contrast. The wound of betrayal is not inherently fatal. It is in truth an invitation to shadow work, a call to acknowledge the darkness, to integrate the shadow, and to heal broken loyalty through a renewed alliance with the self. Judas refused the call. His death marks the triumph of fear over faith, of persona over self. He became the eternal archetype of the one who preferred the annihilation of the body over facing the truth of the soul. The wound of betrayal is not a death sentence. It is an invitation. But what sets Judas apart from Peter, who also failed, who also denied the master, yet survived, transformed, and rose? This archetypal contrast between the two holds the key to understanding how to integrate the shadow instead of being consumed by it. The story of Judas only reaches its full archetypal depth when placed in direct contrast with the story of Peter. Both men failed. Both denied their loyalty to the master at the most crucial hour. Both activated their shadow under unbearable pressure. Yet one became the foundational rock of a new faith, while the other became the eternal archetype of the betrayer. This contrast between Peter and Judas is Jung's most profound lesson on the process of individuation and the proper way to meet the shadow. They represent two possible paths after a moral and psychological collapse. Integration, Peter, versus annihilation, Judas. Let us begin with Peter's failure. Peter's act was denial, a failure driven by fear and cowardice, by the instinct for survival. Peter was impulsive, emotional, a bearer of undisciplined eros, often acting before he thought, as when he struck the soldier's ear. He denied the master not through calculated betrayal, but through a visceral human weakness. Peter's shadow contained unresolved cowardice and unchecked impulsivity. Judas's failure, as we have seen, was betrayal, an act of manipulation and control driven by the rigidity of unintegrated logos. Judas was rational, methodical, the man of order and structure, the one whose persona demanded power and coherence. He betrayed out of political disappointment and intellectual disillusionment, an attempt to force destiny with his own hands. Judas's shadow carried repressed ambition and wounded pride. Both men released their shadow. The crucial difference lay in what they did afterward. When Peter failed and the rooster crowed, what did he do? He went out and wept bitterly. This weeping is the foundational act of radical acceptance. It is eros at work, raw feeling, undiluted, untainted by defenses. Peter's tears were not toxic remorse. They were the beginning of repentance. Peter's repentance meant he integrated his shadow. He accepted the painful truth: I am capable of cowardice. I am capable of failure. And that failure is part of who I am. In accepting his shadow, he disarmed it. He transformed it. He used the pain of his denial as fuel for the humility and unshakable loyalty that would define him thereafter. Peter's self, his totality, grew stronger because he allowed the light of consciousness to illuminate his darkness. Judas, by contrast, tried to reject his shadow. When remorse struck him, he did not cry in humility. He did not break open. He tried to return the money, to rid himself of the symbol of his shadow. His final act of hanging was not a surrender to the self, but the last war cry of an ego that refuses to accept its own flaws. Judas's logos could not process moral chaos. Judas essentially said, I must be perfect, and this failure is so great that the failed one must die with it. He tried to kill the shadow and ended by being consumed by it. He failed at the shadow work. And thus emerge two archetypal destinies. 1. Peter, the archetype of redemption, individuation. He became the rock, not because he stopped failing, but because he integrated his failure. His strength did not come from perfection, but from totality, the union of his leadership with his cowardice. He allowed himself to be whole, human, imperfect. Judas, the archetype of tragedy, annihilation. He became the eternal traitor because he refused to accept his shadow. His rigidity prevented transformation. He could not evolve from the legalism of logos to the compassion and forgiveness of eros. The Jungian lesson is clear. Failure is not the problem. The rejection of failure is. Peter used his pain to open the heart, eros, and to accept the dark contours of his own psyche. Judas used his pain to activate self-destruction, logos in its most punitive form. If Judas's story shows us what unfolds when the shadow remains unintegrated, the total destruction of the individual, Peter's story reveals the hope. The shadow is the path to wholeness. By accepting our capacity to betray, to lie, to fail, we disarm the shadow and transform it into humility and wisdom. Failure is not the problem. Rejecting the failure is. The contrast between Peter and Judas reveals that each of us carries a shadow of the deceiver. But how do we identify and transform our own silver coins today, the small betrayals we commit against our own self. The story of Judas Iscariot is not a historical relic. It is a psychic mirror held up to our modern lives. His darkest legacy is not the act of betrayal itself, but the eternal question: where are our 30 pieces of silver today? Where do we sacrifice loyalty to our own self in exchange for validation, security, or external approval? The shadow of the deceiver usually doesn't appear in our lives as a dramatic act of treachery. It reveals itself in the small, cumulative betrayals we commit against our own soul. In contemporary life, the 30 pieces of silver take the shape of success metrics, social acceptance, and the dictatorship of performance. The Judas archetype teaches us the cost of wearing a persona for too long, of sacrificing authenticity for belonging. Betrayal of eros, feeling, and intuition. We live in a society still ruled by the rigidity of logos, logic, efficiency, reason. We are pressured to silence our anima, the inner voice of intuition and feeling. Our silver coins are the moments when we ignore our gut instinct about a job, a relationship, a decision, because something looks logical on paper. Each time we silence that quiet inner voice, we betray the deepest source of our own wisdom, repeating Judas's mistake by devaluing eros. Betrayal of purpose for status. Often we trade life purpose for financial safety or social prestige. Taking a job that drains us, staying in a career that crushes the soul just to uphold a collective persona of success, I matter because of this title, is an archetypal betrayal. The salary becomes the coin that marks the trade. We sell the time of our soul to feed the ego's hunger for recognition. Betrayal of the shadow for image, the dictatorship of likes. The digital world has turned the persona into a 24-hour facade. We chase external validation through likes, applause, and visibility. To remain admired, we hide the uglier or weaker parts of the shadow, our vulnerability, our anger, our honest sadness. The forced smile, the perfect photo, the curated life, all become acts of betrayal against the self in exchange for collective approval. These are our modern coins of silver. And like Judas, such self-betrayal breeds toxic remorse, manifesting as anxiety, depression, and the chronic sense of emptiness. This remorse is not transformative, like Peter's repentance. It is the result of dissociation, the soul separating from the persona because the mask has become an unsustainable lie. The shadow of the deceiver, when unintegrated, whispers that the problem is external. If I had more money, more status, then I would be happy. This is the same illusion that bound Judas, who believed external revolution would bring internal peace. The key to disarming this archetype is recognizing that to the self, there is no such thing as a small betrayal. Each time we silence our intuition, each time we force ourselves into a role that denies us, we drop another silver coin into our psychic pocket. And like Judas's coins, they become a crushing weight of guilt and unlived life. The legacy of Judas is a warning, a call to the urgent necessity of shadow work. We are invited to identify projection. Where are you projecting your power or your salvation? Do you expect a partner, a mentor, a political leader to save you? Where are you demanding that others become the Messiah you fear becoming for yourself? Name the coins. What are you trading your truth for? What comfort, status, or security are you using to justify the betrayal of your purpose? Accept the shadow of the deceiver. The hardest step is admitting our own capacity to deceive and manipulate. Accepting that the deceiver lives within us is the first step towards individuation, for we can only integrate what we are willing to acknowledge. The story of Judas reminds us that wholeness comes only when we withdraw our projections and reclaim our loyalty to the one thing that truly matters, our own self. The price of betrayal is the death of the soul. Healing begins with the courage to reject the 30 silver coins. The wound of betrayal is not fatal. It is an invitation. But how do we close this wound and restore our loyalty to the self without falling into the same cycle of guilt and self-destruction that consumed Judas?
We have arrived at the crucial point of our journey: post-betrayal individuation. The story of Judas has shown us the abyss of annihilation, the destiny of one who refuses to accept the shadow. Peter's path, meanwhile, offers the hope that failure can be transmuted into strength. But what does it actually mean to restore inner loyalty? It is the process of closing the archetypal wound that opens whenever we betray our own self. The key, as always, is to withdraw our projections and integrate the principle of the animus in a healthy way, uniting it with the eros of the heart. The first and hardest step of healing is the radical acceptance of the shadow of the deceiver within us. Judas failed because he sought to annihilate the evil rather than assimilate it. Society teaches us to split ourselves. I am the light. The darkness is a mistake that must be cut away. Analytical psychology teaches the opposite. Wholeness, the self, is achieved only when we acknowledge our inherent capacity for wrongdoing, for deception, for manipulation, the very DNA of the deceiver. To restore inner loyalty means to make an inner declaration. Yes, I am capable of betrayal. I am capable of lying to myself, sabotaging my purpose, and yielding to the 30 silver coins. And I accept this capacity as part of my complex human nature. When we name and accept the shadow, we disarm it. The energy once wasted on repression and on toxic remorse, Judas's downfall, is released and transmuted into consciousness and discernment. It is the alchemy of turning the lead of guilt into the gold of wisdom. The path of individuation requires transforming guilt into responsibility. Guilt, the ego, asks, "Why did this happen to me? How can I get rid of this pain?" leading to remorse and stagnation, and ultimately to self-destruction, as in Judas. Responsibility, the self, asks, "What does this mistake teach me about who I am? How can this awareness shape the way I act now?" leading to repentance, transformation, and growth, as in Peter. Restoring inner loyalty means assuming full responsibility for our past choices without the ego's destructive self-judgment. It is the only way to break the cycle of repeating the same betrayal. Judas's betrayal was, at its core, the failure of his animus to claim internal authority. He projected authority and decisive power onto the master. To heal this wound, the individual must rebuild their animus for women, or their inner logos for men, in an integrated way. Integrated logos is discernment and decisive action that serves the heart, eros, not external ambition. Discernment, logos, is the ability to draw clear boundaries and protect the self. It means saying no to opportunities that look profitable, the silver coins, but violate loyalty to purpose. Decisive action, animus, is the courage to break the rigid persona, to leave the toxic job, to end the limiting relationship. It is action that proves our new inner loyalty is stronger than the fear of loneliness or social judgment. When logos is integrated with eros, the person becomes neither the rigid fanatic that Judas embodied, nor the erratic emotionalist that Peter was before redemption. They become whole, mind, discernment, and heart, intuition, moving in harmony. Inner loyalty is restored because one trusts one's own inner authority, not the external authority Judas so desperately sought. The final step in closing the wound of betrayal is the command of autonomy. The self demands that you become your own master and your own disciple. Judas needed a master to tell him what to do, and a Messiah to tell him what to believe. Healing requires the opposite. The individual must become their own unquestioned source of their truth. Restoring inner loyalty is the act of declaring that your life is yours. You become the sole judge of your choices and the sole architect of your happiness. You break the dependence on authority figures and external ideals. You shatter the slavery of social silver coins. This autonomy is the peace that surpasses remorse. It is the certainty that cannot be bought or sold. It is the only protection against the shadow of the deceiver, both external and internal. Because once you become whole, there is no longer any space for manipulation. The wound is closed. Inner loyalty has been restored. The story of Judas ends in death, but the archetype leaves us one final powerful lesson about ultimate forgiveness. What is the final command that allows you to remove your own Judas mask and receive the kiss of your totality? Our journey through the Judas mask and the shadow of the deceiver brings us to our final destination. The understanding that Judas's tragic end is not a condemnation, but an archetypal warning. He reminds us that the greatest act of violence we can commit is not against others, but against our own self. The story of Judas does not end with his physical death, but with the psychological legacy he leaves behind, the key to our own wholeness. What Judas teaches us is that strength does not lie in denying our capacity for betrayal, but in radically accepting it. The shadow of the deceiver lives in us, in our ability to lie, to manipulate, to place personal gain above the integrity of the soul. His legacy is the command that soul work, shadow work,
is essential for psychic survival. Had Judas listened to the self in the moment of remorse, he could have transformed guilt into humility. He could have turned his shadow into wisdom, as Peter did. The final command of his story is this: do not let your shadow kill you. Integrate it so it may strengthen you. Wholeness, the self, can only be reached when we recognize the divinity within our humanity, with all its flaws, weaknesses, and its innate inclination toward error. True loyalty is not to the persona, but to the whole, the union of light and shadow. And the most powerful, and paradoxically, most redemptive symbol in the story of Judas is the kiss. The kiss of Judas, on the human level, was the pinnacle of betrayal, but on the archetypal level, it represents the union of opposites, the inevitable meeting between light, the master, the self, and darkness, the shadow, the deceiver. The kiss is the unconscious command: accept your shadow. The master received the kiss, a symbol that light is not afraid of darkness. The self is never threatened by the shadow we fear. End the duality. The kiss marks the point where spirit and matter touch each other. It is the point of no return that forces the individual, Judas, to confront his truth. For the one pursuing individuation, the kiss of Judas becomes the kiss of acceptance. It is the moment you finally kiss your own shadow, not with judgment, but with the awareness that the rawest force of the soul lies in what has been repressed. It is the acceptance that you are both light and darkness, the loyal one and the deceiver. Final healing does not come from outside, from priestly forgiveness or social absolution. It comes from the spiritual autonomy Judas rejected. You are your own authority. You are your own proof. Your wholeness is your only inheritance. The path to healing is twofold. Integrate logos, mind. Use reason to discern, to define boundaries, the very skill Judas lacked. Integrate eros, heart. Use feeling to forgive yourself, the tears Judas denied. When mind and heart unite, the Judas mask dissolves, and the self emerges. You no longer fear the silver coins because you know your integrity is worth infinitely more than any external reward. The journey of Judas Iscariot ends where yours begins, with a choice. Will you choose toxic remorse and annihilation, or radical acceptance and wholeness? If the story of the shadow of the deceiver touched the wound of loyalty in you, if you feel the call to reclaim your voice and your inner integrity, your soul work, your shadow work must begin now. Subscribe to Shadow Work Stories and activate the bell so you don't miss the next archetypal journey. Our channel is not about stories. It is about transforming what hurts into wisdom and what has been silenced into voice. Leave a like if you believe in the power of wholeness, and click the video on your screen to continue diving into the journey of the self and reclaim your loyalty to yourself. Remember, your self is waiting. Your integrity is the only master.